Edvard Munch was versatile and remarkably prolific, leaving at his death in 1944 vast numbers of paintings, prints, drawings, watercolors, and sculpture. He was a pioneer of modern art, especially influential to the German Expressionists. Born in Norway in 1863, Munch began his studies with leading Norwegian artists in Oslo at the age of 17. Through the next decade, his work reflected the influences of the naturalism and impressionism prevalent at the time. But by the beginning of the 1890s, he had developed a personal direction for his art. This head of the young artist was sculpted by a friend in 1886. Munch was then 23 years old and had already completed one of his greatest works, the painting called The Sick Child. After a stay in France, where he was impressed by the work of Van Gogh, Gauguin, Toulouse-Lautrec, and Whistler, Munch went in 1892 to Berlin, where he had his first major exhibition. The public was shocked at his paintings, and the exhibition closed. But Munch had found many friends and admirers in Germany, particularly among a group of leading Scandinavian, German, and Slavic writers and artists living in Berlin. During almost 3 years in Germany, Munch developed his idea for a series of related paintings, which he described as a poem on life, love, and death, and later called the Life Frieze. The themes of the Life Frieze are those of sickness and suffering, of the fear of life, of the often cruel and painful relationship between man and woman. They are drawn from the experiences of Munch's own life, but they also reflect the pessimism and subjectiveness which permeated philosophy and literature at the end of the century. Throughout his life, Munch strove to broaden his art. He was constantly searching for new ideas and new ways to express old ones. In 1894, he began to experiment with graphics and soon acquired remarkable understanding and skill in this field. Munch's first graphics were dry-point engravings on copper plates. In this technique, a drawing is made on the metal with a sharp steel needle. Ink is rolled on the plate and then wiped off so that it remains only in the incised lines. When the plate is covered with paper and put through the press, the lines print black and the rest of the surface remains white. As well as engravings, Munch worked with etchings, where the plate of zinc or copper is covered with a wax coating into which the drawing is made with a needle. The plate is immersed in acid, which incises the drawing a desired depth into the metal. The print is made by covering the plate with paper and putting it through a press. Munch often combined the techniques of etching and engraving in a single print. This is one of Munch's earliest prints, a dry point of The Sick Child from 1894. The memory of the death of his elder sister when he was 14 haunted Munch throughout his life. The theme is a recurrent one in paintings and prints. The many aspects of love were central to Munch's work from the early 1890s until 1908. Sometimes these pictures are harsh and violent, sometimes gentle and sad. Most are filled with a deep frustration at the inability of men and women to communicate their hunger for love and their inability to satisfy this need. In almost every love relationship, the dominant figure is the woman. With her rests the happiness or tragedy of love. One of Munch's most lyric visions is the tender moment of the kiss. This etching of 1895 demonstrates his skill in working the metal to create soft, sensitive line and subtle tonal variations. Munch's work is filled with depictions of women of all ages in all moods. He saw her dissipated and grieving, irresistibly young and dreamy, sensual and strong, withered and chaste. In certain prints, Munch experimented with color, as in Bathing Boys of 1897. More often, though, he used much less color in his prints than in his paintings, challenging himself to recapture the impact of a given painted subject by means appropriate to the graphic media, such as the quality of line. The number of etchings and engravings in Munch's work decreased sharply after the turn of the century. There are some fine later examples, however, such as The Oak of 1903, printed from a zinc plate, more rough and bold in execution than any of his earlier etchings. The watercolors which Munch made are sometimes individual works in themselves and sometimes studies for paintings. At times, he also painted in watercolor over certain of his finished graphics. In this watercolor, Munch painted himself sitting with his sister Sophie, the sick child, in the garden of his Oslo home. Throughout his work, Munch strove to simplify form and design. In his paintings and watercolors, a pure form language and strong emotional color are the major sources of expressive effect. Munch printed his first lithographs in 1895. He soon found that lithography offered him greater freedom of execution than engraving, as well as the possibility of working on a larger scale. Munch's lithographs were made by drawing with lithographic ink or grease crayon upon a smoothed limestone block. A mixture of nitric acid and gum arabic was then applied, which fixed the drawing and slightly etched the other parts of the stone. Before printing, the stone was first sponged with water and then rolled with printer's ink. The ink adhered to the oily design, but was repelled by the remainder of the stone surface. In his lithographs, Munch re-explored the themes from his series of paintings, The Life Frieze. Madonna of 1895 is one of his finest prints. Munch made this print in several colors, searching for different visual and expressive effects. He also added details in woodcut and watercolor to some of the completed lithographs. The Shriek, of which there are several painted versions in the life frieze, is also a lithograph. The power and mood of the print are created primarily by line, but Munch has also painted in some of that color which was vital to the mood of the original painting. The Sick Child, which Munch had already painted and engraved, is one of his most sensitive colored lithographs. Munch used a separate stone for each color, and in these prints his extraordinary mastery of the technique and control of the 4 stones required is well demonstrated. A skillful printer is essential for good quality in lithography. Most of Munch's lithographs in 1896 were prepared and printed in Paris by Auguste Clos, the most celebrated printer of his time. The prints which Munch made provided him with an income, so that no longer was he forced to sell his paintings, which he dreaded. He could now keep the pictures of the life frieze together. This is the 3 stages of woman in lithograph. Munch rarely felt that he had exhausted all the possibilities of a motif. Over a period of 20 years or more, he was apt to paint or print the same picture again and again, sometimes altering the color or small details of form. He also liked to repeat the same subject in different media: drawing, painting, etching, lithograph, in each case exploiting to the fullest the individual characteristics of the material with which he worked. Thanks for the Party reveals Munch's taste for caricature and rather grotesque humor. Many of his drawings are of this type. This is a lithograph portrait of Henrik Ibsen, whom Munch greatly admired and respected. Munch's portraits are brilliant portrayals of character. In many cases, he was merciless in the unveiling of personalities. He was also fascinated with his own image, and countless self-portraits give many insights into Munch's life and character. The self-portrait with a bottle of wine shows the artist not long before the nervous breakdown for which he was hospitalized in 1908. As he recovered from this crisis, Munch turned away to a great extent from his old pessimism and personal conflict and began to fill his work with a new strength and energy. His themes, too, were new: men at work in the outdoors, animals, landscapes. In lithograph, he continued through the years to rework his old motifs and to make portraits of his friends. But it was to woodcut of all graphic techniques that he devoted the most energy and achieved the most innovative and richly creative effects. To make a colored woodcut, Munch cut a single block into separate pieces, inked the pieces with the different colors he wanted, and replaced them in the block like the pieces of a puzzle. This was a change from a method in current practice derived from Japanese woodcuts, in which a separate block was used for each color, printing the same paper over several times. Munch's innovation by using only one block simplified the entire printing process and made the finished print more clear and precise. In this print, called Man's Head in Woman's Hair, Munch used one block cut up in this way for the colored areas and another for the drawing. The opportunity which woodcut offered him to cut his designs directly into the block without aid of chemical processes was immensely sympathetic to an artist whose working methods were as personal and spontaneous as Munch's. He worked with blocks of spruce, pine, and mahogany, gouging out everything that was to remain white on the paper, leaving only the areas of shading and the lines of the drawing to be inked. Anxiety is closely related to the shriek. Originally, it was printed in black and white, but Munch felt the same need for color as he had in the shriek, and here he has made the sky red. In still another version, the entire print is red. When Munch transferred a subject from painting to graphics, as he did with this one called Melancholy, it underwent major changes. The strongly emotional color values and lyric undertones of the painting had to be given up, but Munch was able to restate the same composition in an equally effective way, achieving great dramatic power by coming closer than he ever did in painting to that simplification of form he considered so important. Munch cut a new block for Melancholy in 1901, which reversed the entire composition. This is a print from that block. These woodcuts are from the 1897 edition of Toward the Forest. Some prints in this edition are examples of the old method of the Japanese woodcut, rarely used by Munch, in which each color was printed with a separate block. This slightly altered version is from 1915. Munch the kiss in woodcut over and over for a period of 4 years. In these prints, he explored in depth the expressive and decorative possibilities of printing with wood. The grain and texture of the material become increasingly important as the design is simplified. With a minimum of means, the artist achieves a maximum of decorative and expressive effect. As is true in many of Munch's other works, the figure in Blossom of Pain from 1898 bears the artist's own features. The blocks from which Munch's woodcuts were made are often of very great beauty in themselves, glowing with warmth and color. This first version of Two Women on the Beach is from 1898. During the years from 1909 to 1920, Munch reprinted many of his old subjects and motifs, often altering them slightly in color design. To this version of the Two Women of 1917, he has added a moon and its reflection in water, a very characteristic Munch motif. On the woodblock for The Lonely Ones, one can see the faint outline of the moon and its reflection. Munch printed from this block for many years. He evidently wished to make prints from it both with and without the moon, and so he cut the moon from paper or thin plywood and glued it to the block when it was needed. This is a print without the moon from 1917. This is one with it from the same year. Vampire was originally printed as a black and white lithograph of 1895. In 1902, Munch colored some of this edition by printing over with a woodblock. Munch created and explored in depth over 700 different motifs in his graphics. Of these, the woodcuts constitute the smallest number, yet many consider that in them lies his greatest individual statement as an artist. His technical innovations in woodcut were considerable, and he was influential in restoring the technique to a position of importance in European art. Moreover, many of Munch's themes from the life frieze, which he had expressed in paint and other graphic media, reached their final and most definitive form in woodcut. Throughout his life, Munch's art evolved and developed. His work in sculpture, painting, drawing, watercolor, and graphics testifies to the ever-broadening scope of his art. His concern was with human life, his own and that around him. In a form language always growing and changing, he portrayed the constant, unchanging emotions and needs of man. In his graphics particularly, he revealed a rare craftsmanship and ability to exploit the texture and quality of the material with which he worked. But never in Munch's art do technical subtleties prevail. To express himself through paintings or prints was for Munch a need and a confession.